Well, welcome to the Cabinet meeting. As usual, this is being broadcast live via the County Council's website. It will also be archived so you can view it afterwards. Would everyone please remember to switch their microphone on before they speak and turn it off when they've finished speaking. Apologies for absence. We have apologies from Mr. Rushton. And minutes of the last meeting. I move the minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of March 2018 are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed? Urgent items. There are no urgent items. Declarations of interest. Does anyone have interest in respect of any of the items on the agenda? Take that as no. So we move to item 6. Oh, no, we don't. We move to item 4. Items referred from overview and scrutiny. There are no items referred from overview and scrutiny. Item 5, which is the Environment and Transportation 2018-19 Highways Capital Programme and Highways and Transportation Work Programme, which you'll find the details recorded on pages 17 to 48 in your pack. So our first report today seeks our approval of the Environment and Transportation Capital Programme for the 2018-19 financial year, along with the related work programme. The Environment and Transportation Overview and Scrutiny Committee considered this report last week, and its comments are attached to your order paper marked 5. Also attached is a revised Appendix A, which was circulated at that scrutiny meeting and has been appended to the draft minutes. Ian Veers, Assistant Director, Highways and Transportation, will present the report, and I will ask Blake Payne, our Cabinet lead member, to speak. Ian.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, this is the 18-19 capital programme we're bringing to you today. We do this on a yearly basis for authority not only to spend this amount of money but also to publish it on the website. As you previously mentioned, we do have an amended Appendix A, and just to explain briefly without going into the detail, the reason for that amendment is, as members will be aware, we've had quite an interesting winter with a number of more defects appearing on the network. So our programme is a very much a live programme, and we have made amendments to where some of the funding is going to deal with that, and that has been reflected in the new appendix. The actual summary table at the beginning of Appendix A is still as per the medium-term financial strategy. The detail afterwards is where the amendments into more restorative patching work and preventative surface dressing has been identified. I could go into more detail if the members wish on that later. Essentially, the report details our capital programme spend for the next year and what we'll be delivering, dealing with large infrastructure planning we're doing to support economic growth, down to our programmes for preventative maintenance. Detailed in the report is quite a section, again, bringing to members' attention our new approach for asset management policy, which will start to come through over the next year and will be reflected into how we deliver under the government's new guidance of a risk-based approach of asset management. That essentially will see some changes in the way we undertake and what we prioritise. So members in future years will see a different report coming forward where we will try and prevent more potholes occurring, to use the layman's terms, rather than having to react more to dealing with them. That will be in line with the government's approach and will enable us to reach higher levels of funding from the government. Essentially, I wasn't going to go through the individual schemes in the programme, but merely to say it's our intention to publish the schemes as we used to under the old highway forums on the website, and we will be updating those quarterly so members can see where, if we receive additional funding in from the government or change a programme, that will be reflected on the website so members are aware of the progress. Are there any questions, Chair?
Right, thank you very much, Ian. Blake.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to refer to the scrutiny minutes and note them, and in essence they encapsulate a very thorough discussion at the scrutiny session last week, ably chaired by David Slater, who chairs the Environment and Transport Scrutiny Panel. But Ian just referred to the asset management approach, which will be changing in October, whilst this is a substantive report on the capital spend of the department, and I'm sure it hasn't gone unnoticed that we have a £114 million provisional capital spend over the next 4 years, which isn't insignificant. I think it is key to inform Cabinet that the approach to asset management will change about October this year, and it has been noted in the minutes that a further report will be brought back to the scrutiny panel to inform members of that panel as to what changes are set in train and how we're going to deal with them. But over and above that, a lot of the information in the report has already been discussed through our medium-term financial strategy and therefore through the budget setting process. I'd like to pass my thanks on to the whole department. I think we should be particularly pleased with the level of success we're currently encountering when it comes to successful bidding from central government for major programmes that we wish to see come to fruition in Leicestershire. And in no small part that's down to the good work of the department and the director at the department, and on behalf of Cabinet I'd like to pass my thanks on. But I have no hesitation, Chairman, in moving the recommendations outlined in the Green Order paper in respect to this item. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Blake. Richard.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm very pleased to second that and to echo all Blake's comments and thanks, and particularly, if I may, Chairman, to refer to the good work done by Scrutiny. It was good to see Scrutiny contributing well to the Council's work, so I'd like particularly to emphasise that. Thank you, Chairman.
Right, thank you, Richard. Any other speakers? I hear none, so it's been moved and seconded. All those in favour? Thank you very much. We now move to item 6. Thank you, Ian. Right, the next report concerns an exception to the Council's contract procedure rules to enable the Council to enter into a contract with a provider of supported living services for 6 service users. And John Wilson is the Director of Adults and Communities, who will present the report, and I will ask Richard Blunt, Lead Member for Adult Social Care, to speak. John.
Thank you, Chair. The Council re-procured the Sporting Living Framework in April 2017 to provide services for people with learning disabilities, mental health and autistic spectrum disorders. The new framework consists of an approved list of providers who provide services across 5 geographical districts of the Council. And most service users, most people in receipt of Sporting Living services, have moved to the new providers. However, there are individual circumstances around a certain number of people who receive services from the Council, which would mean that transferring those services would not be in their best interests. 6 people who live and are receiving services from Knighton Manor would be suffer detriment should we wish to transfer their services at this time, and therefore we're seeking approval for the Cabinet to agree an exception to the Council's contract procedure rules in order that those 6 people can continue to live in their current accommodation with their current care arrangements until such time as we're able to make an adjusted transfer. Thank you.
Richard?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I'm very happy to support what John has just said. This is about 6 very vulnerable individuals, and on that basis I'm happy to move the proposed motion at the top of page number 2.
So, and I'll second it as well. Are there any other speakers? There are none. It's been proposed and seconded. Everyone agree? Thank you very much. That's agreed. Thank you, John. Item 7. This report seeks approval to implement a new strategy which will provide the basis for future planning, commissioning and delivery of special educational needs and disability services across Leicestershire over the next 3 years. Comments have been received from County Councillor Sean Sheehan, and they're attached to the order paper marked 7. Paul Meredith, Director of Children and Family Services, will present the report, and then I'll ask Ivan Old as the lead member to speak. So, Paul.
Good afternoon. Members will be aware we've talked on a number of occasions about some of the pressures that are existing in the system for children with special educational needs and disabilities. This new strategy that we're bringing forward today to seek agreement over sets out how we're going to develop services over the next 3 years, both in terms of planning services and commissioning services, and to meet our statutory requirements in this area. A key element of the principles behind it will be developing our local offer to families in the county to avoid children having to leave the county in the way that they have done previously. We'll be doing that jointly with schools and other partner agencies. In producing this strategy, there's been a significant consultation exercise that's been undertaken with all key partners, schools, colleges, and very important, families who actually use services. We think it's a good document that will see us forward to address some of the both financial pressures and service pressures that have occurred, and that we'll be in a much better place with these services in 3 years' time. So the recommendations are that we note the engagement, that we ask for the strategy as Appendix A to be approved, and that any minor adjustments that need to be made to the strategy in the next 3 years be agreed by the Director.
Jane, do you want to say anything? No? Okay. Right, Ivan.
Thank you, Chair. In looking at this particular document, I'd ask Cabinet members, I'm sure they've read it already, particularly to look at pages 68, 69, 70 and 71 in the report that you're being asked to approve this afternoon. And it's headed Voices That Matter. So this isn't an officer's interpretation, this isn't my interpretation, this isn't members' interpretation. This document is driven by the customers, particularly by their parents. And anybody who's worked in this field, as I have, knows that if you've got a child who's got difficulties when they go to school, you've got major problems, probably for the rest of their school life and beyond. I'm really pleased that we've listened. I've been to some of these events when we've had parents present. The most recent one was held at Twycross Zoo, and before that I went over to the Conker site. Parents are really clear in what they want, and I think this report actually encapsulates the views of parents. When you've gone through the Voices That Matter, what's working well, what's not working well, what needs to happen, you'll be familiar with the signs of safety approach that we were involved in piloting a number of years ago, and it shows a very clear way forward. That we then went out and talked to our frontline practitioner partners, and again you've got the same breakdown: what's working well, not working well, and what needs to happen. And then it's finally shaped up on page 72, where the strategic priorities for the next 3 years are actually listed quite clearly. So I'd recommend this report to Cabinet. I think the officers have done a very good job. I think they've worked really well with parents, with young people. The one caveat that I have is that throughout parents' views, it's the child who isn't yet in benefit of an education, health and care assessment plan, who maybe is waiting for that to happen, who seems to be in a certain area of limbo. Now, we can't tell schools what their curriculum will be, and we cannot organise schools what they should offer, but this document sets out a continuum of provision from those who need a separate type of school right the way through to those who can function with support in the classroom in mainstream schools, and as such I commend it.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. Pam, are you going to second it?
I am going to second it, and I agree with everything that Ivan has just said. I think it's a very good strategy. The fact that we've listened and we've spoken to the parents and the families is really beneficial, because so often I get mothers, fathers come talking to me about the children with these special education needs, and they feel that nobody listens to them, nobody understands, and it is a really traumatic thing when you give birth to a baby and a few years later you're told sometimes that they have got these extra special needs, and sometimes families see that going right into the distance, and they really don't know what they're going to do. But there is some brilliant work done these days, in schools particularly. And if those of you use YouTube, Birchwood School in Melton has just done this wonderful video where they've been signing to this modern music. And it absolutely, I mean, people have been in tears watching it. But the sort of things that these youngsters can do, and also when they get the special help that they need, it actually makes them much more independent and wanting to do things and wanting to try things, and they're less dependent on what mum and dad can do in some cases. So I'm really happy to second this motion. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'd just like to ask you some questions on there. I mean, I'm always very impressed by the work that SEND teachers do, and all the staff in special schools especially. It's an extremely challenging work, but I should imagine once you get into it and see the rewards from the work, it's very people do it, find it very worthwhile too. Can you tell me though why we get a significant number of pupils excluded from these schools? That always just surprised me how that comes about.
Sorry, Chair, are you referring to exclusions from our special schools? From my knowledge, our exclusion rates at special schools are very low, so our special schools are predominantly providing for pupils with profound and multiple learning difficulties, and our exclusion rates in Leicestershire are incredibly low, and part of that is because we have a good wider inclusion strategy that supports pupils to move to different schools to meet needs. So often we're able to meet the needs of pupils rather than excluding them both from mainstream and special schools.
I mean, certainly there can be... I mean, clearly something has to be done, but does excluding them do any good?
No, exclusion as a process for children isn't a positive experience. What the strategy that we've got in Leicestershire is very much focused across both mainstream and special schools to not exclude pupils, because the experience of being excluded is negative as well as the run-up to being excluded. So we have a really good secondary behaviour partnership that works with pupils to move them around. We've got some really good engagement with alternative providers. So often we're able to move pupils prior to them being excluded, so if they're at risk of exclusion, to offer a different kind of provision that might better meet their needs. What we're also doing to better develop our provision, which is set out in the strategy, is work with some of our mainstream schools to develop what we're calling resource-based provision. So for pupils with additional needs, particularly around autism, we're developing some units within our mainstream provision that will enable young people to remain successful and stay in mainstream provision, but with much more intensive wraparound support. And again, that ought to reduce exclusions, but also reduce costs around independent provision, but also enable children to remain local in local provision as well.
Okay, well that's reassuring, thank you. Any other speakers? None. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favour? That's approved. Thank you very much. That's agreed. Right, we now move to item 8, which is NHS Sustainability and Transformation Plan or Partnership, depending on how you see it. This paper clarifies the County Council's relationship with the NHS, both in terms of the services already delivered in partnership and ongoing transformation and integration of health and social care. It also sets out the Council's role in the Sustainability and Transformation Plan and Partnership, known as the Better Care Together, across Leicestershire, Leicester and Rutland. John Sinnott, the Chief Executive, and John Wilson, the Director of Adults and Communities, will present the report. Well, John's sitting on my left, but who's actually going to lead on this?
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to emphasise that the County Council has always prioritised the integration of health and care services. And with that in mind, we've invested significantly in the area, and we have a very good track record, and we want to maintain that. But the position now needs to be seen in the context of what you've referred to, and I'll just call the STP. It was an initiative introduced nationally by the NHS 2 years ago as a means of reducing, ideally eliminating, national and local budget deficits. and prioritising integration to reduce the pressures on acute services. I think it's fair to say there is little evidence of success. And in my view, in large part because the NHS consistently focus on in-year finances, which precludes medium-term planning. And the acute sector, while still receiving the majority of funding, remains under increasing pressure. Chairman, you were one of a number of members around the table who had a meeting with the NHS before Christmas. Then, and subsequently in discussion, which I've been involved in, it's become apparent that the Council cannot support the sort of ST plan which the NHS locally intend to publish at some stage later in the year. And that is the case for the City Council in Rutland as well. The reasons include concerns around governance and the role of local authorities, the size of the NHS financial gap over the planned period, and the lack of detail as to how that gap could be closed. There is a general concern as to whether the plan to be published will actually be deliverable. The particular concerns around governance arise from at least three things. The first is the increasing work on integration being undertaken on the geographical basis of the city, county and Rutland, with no accountability to elected members. The second one is the difficulty the local NHS has in integrating itself, and to me, the NHS integrating itself has always been a precondition of health and social care integration. And the third one is the consequence of no effective system coordination, leadership or governance, whether you define system as health and care or just health. Those and other concerns are reflected in the recommendations on the Green Order paper, which include specific roles being identified here for Cabinet scrutiny and the Health and Wellbeing Board. If I could summarise before John comes in, the officer's view is there is increasing risk of the STP frustrating ongoing progress, which, together with partners, we've made on health and care integration, and that is a pity. We need to do something about it. The reasons why we think in those terms, John will expand on now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Another John now.
Thank you. Yes, as John noted, the County Council has invested heavily over the last 2-3 years on system integration, and officers of the County Council have led on a number of areas of development of new service models. However, progress has been hampered by a lack of clear governance and system leadership. And the absence of overall STP programme management has led to a lack of clarity about scope, a duplication of effort, and confusion and inability to take forward the dependencies and independencies of what is quite a complex programme of integration. In addition, I think it's worth saying that the STP governance process has led to often complex and complicated decision-making processes whereby organisations don't act as a system but act individually, and decisions have to be taken back into individual organisations, and sometimes those decisions are either overturned or come back with different outcomes through different organisation systems without any kind of system accountability. So some examples of how that's affected us. First is in respect to the Home First programme, which is aiming to provide people with services outside of hospitals when they get into crisis. And it's been very difficult to lead that work when much of the work has been taking place within the programme, hasn't been coordinated effectively through individual organisations. And the accountability within organisations has led to decisions being made which are outside of the programme or which conflict with the programme outcomes. Another area is in terms of integrated locality team development, where we're trying to develop services around primary care, health and social care, working together with primary care to provide people with the best services in the community. But that programme has itself been delayed due to variable implementation, both across the footprint, as John mentioned, working across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland has been tricky, but also across the county. There's been variable implementation leading to different models of care within different parts of the county. And in February of this year, we had to regrettably formally close the Integrated Points of Access programme due to an inability of NHS partners across the system to agree an investment model to support the continued delivery of an integrated access point, which would have provided service users, patients, public professionals with a single point of access to health and social care services. And that despite the County Council agreeing to front-load the revenue support to deliver the programme, which would have enabled partners in the NHS to defer their required investment. I would, however, want to say that notwithstanding these difficulties, progress does continue to be made to deliver new models of care and to deliver integrated health and social care offer to the people of Leicestershire. And it was very much our intention to continue that work with colleagues to ensure that people receive health and social care services when they need them, where they need them, and to get the best possible outcomes. Thank you.
Well, okay, thank you very much, John. Now, Pam, lead member for Health, your comments, please.
Thank you very much. I won't go over what both Johns have already said. It is fair to say that it is a really complex situation, and it is also true to say that the NHS don't function like local authorities do, and they have difficulty in understanding sometimes how we work, particularly how we're scrutinised and we have governance, and I think that's very important. And I do believe that as a local authority, we have a much closer working relationship with our residents than the NHS does. But I think we are where we're at. We do need to try and strike a balance between working with the NHS and working alongside the NHS. And there is a significant amount of work to be undertaken in how we work with the NHS. And I think the Health and Wellbeing Board has a real role in helping to develop these services as well. Having said that, I am proposing the motions A to F on the Green Order paper, and I would ask for the Cabinet's support on that.
Okay, thank you, Pam. Ivan.
Thank you, Chair. I would support Pam in everything that she said, and indeed I would support the officers. You only have to look at the appendix on page 111 to see a very clear definition of the Cabinet role, the scrutiny role, and the Health and Wellbeing Board role. Although I sit on the Health and Wellbeing Board, and indeed have been a member since it was first set up, I don't actually think that from paragraph 6 through to 8, that we've necessarily achieved what we should be achieving. And I think that under Pam, with her very clear experiences since she's been standing in for the late Ernie White and being confirmed in post, she's got a very clear way that we need to move forward. And I'm happy to second the motion on the Green Order paper.
Thank you, Ivan. I'll just add a little bit to this. I went to a meeting with colleagues from here and with the management of the principal providers and commissioners in the NHS just before Christmas. I must admit, it was the first time I'd really been exposed to the differences in culture between us in local government and the accountability that we have. And what seems to me, and they may argue with me about this, a detachment of their management from that accountability to the people they serve. There was only one doctor, by the way, present at the meeting. The rest of them were management people. So I exclude from that any criticism of doctors and clinical staff and nurses and people on the front line. But their management seems to be very different. And this is where we have the difficulty, because we have to deal with the management, and the management are not always responding and often don't realise the pressures of accountability in the way that we do, and this is why we've got this problem. But nevertheless, we are where we are, and we have to try to work with them as best we can. So it's been moved and seconded. Are there any other speakers? No. So we all agreed the motion? Yeah, agreed. Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Right, item 9 concerns the consultation on the draft national policy statement for geological disposal infrastructure and working with communities. This report concerns 2 consultations issued by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy regarding the geological disposal of higher activity radioactive waste, and seeks approval of the Council's proposed responses. Comments have been received from County Councillor Mr Hunt on behalf of the Labour Group. These are attached to your order paper marked 9. And we have with us Lonik Vojtilevich, Head of Planning and Historic and Natural Environment, and he's going to present the report. And after Lonik's spoken, I'll move the motion.
Thank you, Chairman. As you quite rightly say, two documents for consultation. The first is the National Policy Statement, which is a guide as to how the proposed developments will be assessed, and they'll be part of the Nationally Significant Infrastructure Project Process, or NSIP, as it's called. Those decisions will be made by the Secretary of State via the Planning Inspectorate. And the County Council, in those circumstances, will be a consultee if such a proposal is within the county or within an adjacent local authority area. And the recommended responses to the questions is set out in Appendix A. And the only issue I would like to raise is that there is just one omission that we'd recommend that take into account, and that's how you deal with the construction material and the excavation material that's coming out of any facility that is to be proposed. The second consultation, working with communities, is perhaps a more complicated consultation. That sets out how communities should be engaged in the process for these facilities. And the underlying principle here is that these sort of facilities will only be developed or come forward if communities are prepared to accept them. The consultation document sets out how that engagement process is to work, including the offer of significant community funds to those communities, particularly those who progress to develop investigative boreholes and access potential sites. Of course, the issue here that communities can withdraw from this process up until the point of where there is a formal test of public support. Again, the detailed responses to this proposal is in Appendix B. Perhaps 3 things to highlight for you. I think how you define communities is not clear. There's a lack of clarity about how much funding will come forward at later stages. The government says significant, but we don't know what that means. And it's also very unclear about the potential veto role that the County Council or other local authorities may have. So those are the 3 key things that I think we'd like to raise. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much, Lonik. I read this paper with some interest. I mean, many years ago, I was a physics student and I went to lectures on the subjects of radioactivity and the dangers of radioactive, not of waste, but of radioactive material. I can well remember a lecturer bringing this sort of canister made of, I suppose, steel. It was a huge thing he brought into the lecture theatre, and then with a pair of tongs he sort of pulled out a sort of cage which had some radioactive cobalt on it. It didn't look at all threatening, and until one of my neighbours turned to me and said, "You better make sure he doesn't drop it." But he didn't drop it, fortunately, but I mean, it certainly went to a lot of trouble to explain to us the dangers, and a lot of people get very concerned about this. It's curious that in parts of the country where nuclear industry takes place, I'm thinking particularly up in Cumbria, those that are involved in the nuclear industry and live very close to it actually take a fairly sensible view of this and are prepared to have disposal facility in their neighbourhoods, which is just as well because they've got it in their neighbourhoods as it is, because they don't take it off the site at the moment. So it's not disposed of anywhere. And one of the worst places you can think of putting radioactive waste is leaving it on the surface. Sometimes some of it is so volatile you have to keep it cool all the time. So sometime this has got to be resolved, and this waste has got to be properly stored and got rid of, and therefore it has to happen. Now, as far as I know, and Lonik will confirm this, there are no proposals to bring any of it to Leicestershire at the moment, are there?
That's correct, Chairman. So there are no site-specific proposals in this consultation. It's a matter for communities or someone showing an interest in having it in their area.
So what this paper is all about is how we would deal with it if they did, and how we would manage it. So it's a bit of a theoretical position, but it's something we need to be prepared for if ever this came forward. The motion on the order paper sets out how we would do that, and it is to approve that response to the two consultation documents. So I move that motion, which is on the order paper. And Louise, I think you'd like to second it, wouldn't you?
Yes, I'll second that, Chair. I think the officers have highlighted the key areas. It will be a sensitive issue if it ever came about, but I think the community engagement would be key to that, for education about the situation as well as, finding out how they feel. So I'm pleased to support this.
Right, any other speakers? Can I have a show of hands then? Do we all agree with that? Thank you very much. Thank you, Lonnie. And I think almost the last item of substance. Anyway, we've got 1 or 2 things. Developer contributions towards county council services. So this is our final report. It provides an update on developer contributions received and not received to meet demands placed on services created by development across the county. And we still have Lonnie Wojciechowicz with us, and he's going to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the only thing I'd like to bring to your attention is an amendment to the report, just to update the situation. Things have developed since the report was published, and it's on page 132 in the table, Chair. And if you look down at the table for Breedon Priory nurseries, and the figure there, 71,012, should be 44,201, and correspondingly at the end of paragraph 17, or in the last sentence of paragraph 17, the last sentence of paragraph 17 on page 133 says 97,823 to 26,811. That 26,811 should read 53,622. So we've got a bit more than it was reported there, and that's because the District Council have foregone their request for affordable housing and therefore more available for education. Not the full amount, but certainly some way better towards it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lonnie. I'll move this motion to note the report. It's very important, and the District Councils, I think, we brought this to their attention on a number of occasions, and we consistently do. That it's important that they back us up on developer contributions so that we can fulfil our statutory obligations, in particular, especially with regard to highways and towards education. It seems from this report that, generally speaking, they do, but sometimes there are exceptional cases like the one you've just referred to in the amendment. And we have to accept that situation as it arises. But it's important that we stay focused on it, otherwise we will find it very difficult to fund these essential developments. So I'll move that motion. And Ivan, would you like to second it?
I would like to second it, Byron, because I've continuously raised the issue of the variability of education contributions across the county, and it's a subject that still mystifies me. Only last week I signed one off for one council where 7 houses have given us £70,000 in education contributions, and I contrast that with another council where 22 private houses were deemed to be not viable for any education contribution at all. So it is a subject very dear to my heart, and one that I shall continue to pursue.
Thank you, Ivan. Any other speakers? It's been moved and seconded. Those in favour? Thank you very much. Thank you, Lonnie. And finally, it should be urgent items, but there are no urgent items. So that brings the meeting to a close. Thank you all very much for attending.